All right, and welcome back to the forecast card. Pretty solid day. 3-2. Alcorn just they look terrible. I think they lost that game by like 20 points. Nothing to say about them. Nicole's they were kind of either winning or keeping it tight all game, and then they kind of just imploded in like the final 3 minutes, giving up like three threes in a row, and then they just couldn't make it back. So shitty one. Felt pretty good for about like 30 minutes of that game, but then they kind of gave it up. Wichita State, pretty sweat free. They actually almost ended up winning that game outright. Florida A&M, very sweaty. They played terrible in the first half, came all the way back, and managed to only lose by 3, so that was nice. Montana State, obviously, sweat free. They end up winning by 15 points, dominated both halves. So we take it. Locks moved to 10-4 on the year, 3-2 on the day. Green Day, 2-1 in NBA. So overall, cannot complain. Let's get into the 7 games that I like for tomorrow. All right, heading on to game number 1, we have Georgia heading on the road to play South Carolina. Now, South Carolina, of course, after like their 14th lose streak, whatever. They're starting to win games. They won a solid win over Arkansas and Texas, but I think Georgia is a step up, and they are on a mission. This is a Georgia team that, prior to the last 2 wins, had lost 9 of their last 11. I think they're trying to do one final push here to have any kind of chance at making the NCAA tournament. And they've been on a mission. They went at home, they dominated Florida, then they went on the road and they dominated Texas. Now they're staying on the road here, playing a South Carolina team that's coming off arguably a pretty big letdown spot after dominating Arkansas by 19 points. I think we see a similar game here as the Mississippi game where they lost by 4. I think South Carolina can hold their own for most of the game, but this Georgia team, they are playing a little bit too well. Obviously, Georgia won the first matchup by 11, and that's arguably when Georgia was playing really, really bad. That's when they had lost 4 in a row, then they got to beat South Carolina, and then after that game, they only beat LSU and lost basically for another 5 in a row. I think this is another spot where Georgia just is a bad matchup for South Carolina. Obviously, South Carolina at home is a completely another beast. They've kept it pretty close against some really elite teams like Florida, Auburn, but again, Georgia coming off 2 massive wins. This is not going to be a true travel spot for them. Obviously, it's not that far, their last game, so they probably are chilling at home for 2-3 days, locking in. South Carolina, their season's been over for a very long time. They play hard at home, but this is arguably their last home game. Maybe they're going to show up for it. But they have one more game against Tennessee, which arguably is a bigger game for them to end off on a high note. I just don't see it. I think Georgia's playing way, way too well. Matchup-wise, obviously Georgia's been not historically a very good road team, but they're playing with a different energy the last 2 games. I just saw it in their eyes. They look like they're determined. They're a team that is going to force a lot of turnovers from South Carolina. Obviously, South Carolina is really good on their own boards. So that's somewhere where Georgia typically relies on a lot of points. It's getting offensive rebounds, but I think Georgia is going to be way too good in the paint. Top 15 in near basket percentage against a South Carolina team that doesn't defend the paint well. They'll find some success from 3 against South Carolina team that doesn't defend the 3 well. Really, the only way I see South Carolina getting really easy points here is free throws, and again, Georgia doesn't really foul that much. I think they're playing way too well. They're the better team. They got all the momentum coming into this game. I think they keep this game extremely close, if not winning outright. So, give me Georgia here on the 6 p.m. game. All right, heading on to game number 2, we have LSU versus Kentucky. Now, obviously LSU is a pretty scrappy team. They've kept it pretty close against some pretty good teams, but I think they're coming into this game against a pissed-off Kentucky team that just got embarrassed by Auburn. They're going to get to stay at home. LSU going to be the second game of a road trip. And again, I don't really think this is a particularly a good matchup for LSU. If you look at where LSU typically likes to score, they're a team that really heavily relies on getting offensive boards and shooting threes. That's kind of the 2 ways they score the most points. And on the offensive glass, this is a Kentucky team top 20 in limiting those opportunities. They're not going to have a significant edge there. Kentucky, they don't turn the ball over really at all. They're top 10 in limiting points off steals. And they're top 12 3-point defense. This is the LSU team that shoots 42% of their shots from 3. They might have some success in the paint. That's probably where they're going to have to get most of their points. But on the other side, Kentucky, they're going to dominate the offensive glass. This is an LSU team that has struggled all year in defending their own glass. They're ranked outside of the top 300 in limiting those second chance opportunities. They're going to turn the ball over a ton. Kentucky, they're going to find success, especially from three against a decent LSU 3-point defense. But again, the competition that Kentucky's played compared to LSU is pretty significant. And again, Kentucky, I think they want this win to solidify their. Obviously, they're going to make it to the tournament, but I think they may want to improve their seeding a little bit, and it is possible if they win out with the rest of the year. So, yeah, I think this is going to be a tough matchup for an LSU team. Kentucky, they play incredibly well at home. One of the best home teams in college basketball. Top 20 in college basketball. Number 2 in their conference. They played the third hardest schedule in college basketball. Especially after a loss, it's kind of where they play their best ball. LSU just played Mississippi State. Pretty rough loss there. They lost 3 in a row heading into this game. Head-to-head wise, LSU has actually dominated this head-to-head cover-wise on the last 4 games, but I think this Kentucky team shows up. LSU is likely going to be without their 2 best rebounders this game. Obviously, Kentucky's still going to be without one of their top scorers in Jackson Robinson. But again, Jalen Reed also is one of their, the 3 scorers in LSU that historically was putting up double digits. They're going to be without Corey Chess. These are the 2 guys that lead rebounding on their team. Without those 2 guys, I think Kentucky is going to eat them up on the boards here. Obviously, Jackson Robinson is an important piece for Kentucky, but they are way more deep of a team than LSU, who only going to have 2 scorers that average over 10 points, while Kentucky has 6. 5, obviously, with Jackson Robinson not playing. Yeah, I think this is going to be a complete blowout game here. I think Kentucky has way more motivation. They're at home where they play well. Yeah, give me Kentucky to win this game by 20 points. All right, heading on to game number 3. Now, I picked this game and I picked St. Louis in that game last time these 2 teams played back in January. But I still believe that the stats should be true in this game. Obviously, Dayton won that game by 8, and I'm pretty sure they were like 1-point underdogs in that game. It was basically a pick'em, and they won that game pretty convincingly. But the Dayton team shot way too well from 3 against the St. Louis team that defends the 3 really well. I think they're going to show up in this game in that revenge spot. They're coming off 3 solid wins here, which I think is going to ride a wave for them. Last time they played these 2 teams, they were coming off a disgusting loss against St. Bonaventure on the road. Now in this game, obviously it's going to be a true travel spot for them. Dayton's going to be playing their second game at home. But I didn't like what I saw against Dayton versus Richmond. They really didn't look that impressive against their last few wins. Duke, they only won by 1. Obviously, they beat up Fordham team, but I think St. Louis is a much better team than that. I think 6.5 is a little bit too much, if I'm being honest, especially given a revenge spot here for St. Louis, who I do believe has been playing really, really well. Obviously, they haven't covered in their last 4 games that they've traveled this far, other than their game against Illinois State. But Dayton, their last 4 games at home have all been really close. 6-point game, 5-point game, 1-point game, 10-point game. And some of those teams are worse than St. Louis is. I really like that we're getting them in a revenge spot. Obviously, St. Louis has some injuries, but nothing honestly too significant here. But yeah, when you look at the matchup, again, St. Louis going to be coming into this game with a lot of momentum. But they're a team that shoots a lot of threes. Dayton does not defend the 3 really well at all. It's the one thing they defend the worst. Behind their near basket, which is what St. Louis shoots the second most, with 40% of their shots. And that is something that Dayton has struggled all year. They're ranked 300th in near basket defense. I think St. Louis should not struggle offensively like they did last game. I think they're going to watch the tape, see what went wrong. They're going to figure out why they got crushed by this Dayton team at home. And Dayton, on the other side, they're a team that shoots a lot of threes and near basket. They may find some success from 3, but in the paint, like St. Louis is a top 40 near basket defense. This is a Dayton team that probably will force some turnovers. But I do think St. Louis is going to find success here. If St. Louis can limit the amount of turnovers that they have in this game, obviously Dayton plays really aggressive defensively. I think they can come away with a win here in the Atlantic 10. So I'm going to take 6.5. I think in the revenge spot, it's hard for me to believe that they're going to allow Dayton to score as insanely well as they did last time. Dayton at home has not been playing nearly as well as they typically have in the past. St. Louis plays a little bit worse on the road, but if you look at their last 5 ratings, St. Louis has been playing really well. They're riding off a lot of momentum here. And typically this kind of quality of team is something that they do like to play decently well against. Dayton kind of only shows up against elite teams, like top 25, or really bad teams. This is kind of a spot where Dayton typically falls flat. So I like St. Louis here in the revenge spot. All right, and that brings us to game number 4, which is going to be our lock of the day. It's going to be Iowa State minus 8.5. Iowa State, they've been dealing with injuries all year. They're finally fully healthy. They won't have a single injury coming into this game. BYU likely going to be missing out on one of their top 5 players. This is already a BYU team that is not deep at all. They have 2 scorers that average over 10 points. And these are, they shoot a ton of threes. Now, losing Catchings, he's a player that has been pretty solid for them off the bench. I think that's going to be a problem. I genuinely do. Now, BYU, if you look at the amount of minutes that their players play, no one averages more than 30 minutes. Having to push them here in an Iowa State home environment, that's pretty tough. I think they're going to not be able to shoot like they typically do. Iowa State, at home, they're borderline top 5 team. They're so good at home. BYU falls off significantly on the road, mostly because they just cannot hit threes like they can at home. They're obviously not nearly as comfortable. BYU has been rolling, which is probably why we're getting this kind of number. They're coming off dominant wins over West Virginia, Kansas State, Kansas, where they beat by 34 points. A tight win over Arizona State by 10, West Virginia by 21. They've been playing really, really well, don't get me wrong. But Iowa State, they just showed that they're healthy and they're strong again. They had a tough loss on the road to Houston where they kept it pretty close for most of the game. Tough loss against Oklahoma State, which was arguably pretty embarrassing. They locked back in, and they went and completely dominated Arizona, beating them by 17 points, which was obviously super impressive considering how good Arizona has been. It's going to be a true road spot for BYU, where they're going to be traveling over 900 miles for this game. Last 3 games, they've had to travel over 500 miles. They've lost 3 of those, 3 of 5, including 31-point loss to Houston, 11-point loss to Mississippi, 9-point loss to NC State. They won that game, and a 4-point loss to TCU. Meanwhile, Iowa State, their last 4 games at home, dominant win over Arizona, dominant win over Colorado, dominant win over Cincinnati, dominant win over TCU. So this is just an Iowa State team that shows up at home. They obviously have some more ground to pick up after they had a bit of a rough stretch there, especially with injuries, where they lost 3 in a row against Arizona, Kansas State, Kansas. And then they had their 2 most recent losses against Houston, Oklahoma State. This was at some point a team that people considered to be a top 5 in the country. But again, if you look at the matchups here, obviously BYU was riding some of the best momentum in college basketball, but Iowa State at home, they're a consistent scorer, and I think they're going to struggle to score here. Iowa State, they're an elite team at, obviously BYU is good at limiting boards, but I think Iowa State's going to force a ton of turnovers. They're going to have probably no problem scoring against this pretty mediocre BYU defense. On the other side, BYU, they rely heavily on threes. That's basically all they do. Shooting about 50% of their shots from 3. Iowa State, pretty decent 3-point defense. It's only going to get better as they lock up at home. They limit mid-range shots. BYU really is going to have some success in the paint, but it's not really a shot that they typically like to take a lot of. They're not going to get to the line very much. I just think this environment here in the Big 12, I think the fact that the records are this close, I think Iowa State is way more talented. And I think their defense is going to show up big time here. So give me Iowa State to win this game big by 10 points at home. All right, heading on to game number 5. We have Syracuse head on the road to play SMU. Now SMU, obviously they're kind of a wagon. Everyone knows they're one of those teams that have the ability to blow you out by 40 points. They have a very fast and potent offense. But I genuinely do believe that this is actually a pretty good matchup for Syracuse. Now 12.5 on the road is still a line that SMU could dominate. Just hitting 3 threes in a row and then the line's dead, right? But kind of do like the spot. Now, if you look at how SMU likes to score, they're really not that amazing at the way they shoot the ball, but they're really, really good on the offensive board. They're number 13 in second chance opportunity percentage. But this is a Syracuse team that is ranked 2nd in college basketball in limiting second chance opportunities. And I think that's going to be a problem for an SMU team that really does rely on it. I think SMU is going to force a lot of turnovers. That is a problem for Syracuse, and one of the advantages for SMU. In the paint, Syracuse is a pretty decent defense. On the other side of the ball, Syracuse, I think they're going to find some success on the offensive board. They're going to find some success in the paint. That's where SMU really struggles to defend the most. Yeah, I don't know. I do really like the spot. Plus, if you look into it a little bit longer, yes, SMU is technically the home team here, but their last game that they did play was on the completely opposite coast. So, Syracuse has already been on the East Coast, and this is not going to be a travel spot for them, even though they are on the road. And SMU is going all the way from Stanford, which is in California, all the way to Texas, which is a pretty far travel spot, over like 1,000 miles. And so SMU really is going to be the team here that is going to be in the travel spot. Syracuse coming off a tough loss where they put up 95 points, but lost to Virginia Tech. But yeah, I truly do believe that this isn't a terrible spot for Syracuse. Obviously, it's very possible SMU just wins this game by 50 points, but matchup-wise, if SMU shots aren't falling, I don't think they're going to have too much success on the offensive board. And this is for Syracuse, the last game of a road trip before they go home and play Virginia. SMU, obviously this is their last home game, so you could argue they're going to show up big for it. But yeah, I do like the spot for Syracuse. So yeah. All right, and my last two bets are Ball State and Florida State. Now, there's really no true reason for either of these games that I personally analyzed, but model-wise, I have this game for Ball State as a pick'em. We're getting 3.5 points. Obviously, Central Michigan is the better team here, but Ball State is really, really good at home. Central Michigan plays really poorly on the road. I think Ball State's been locking in at home lately, and in terms of Mid-American, obviously they technically have a better record than Central Michigan, despite Central Michigan being a much better team. But I do think Ball State here is going to get to the line a ton. They're going to get a ton of offensive boards, and they just play a bunch more motivated at home. The other game we have is Florida State. It's Virginia. Both these teams, Florida State more so, had a really rough start, a really good start, and then they've kind of been dog shit lately. Meanwhile, Virginia's kind of starting to feel, get used to their team. But again, this is a Florida State team that does really good on the offensive glass. Virginia team that still struggles there. I think Florida State's going to find a lot of success in the paint. They're going to get to the line a decent amount. The other side, if Virginia's threes aren't falling, that's pretty much their only spot where I think they're going to have a lot of success scoring in this game. Yeah, I think Florida State can win this game outright, if not keep it pretty close. They're just a more consistent team. They play at a much faster pace. That might be annoying for Virginia, who tries to slow the game down. Yeah, I think Virginia's kind of checked out here, and Florida State still has some hope to potentially have some crazy run in the ACC, but very unlikely. Yeah, give me Florida State plus 4.5 and Ball State plus 3.5. In terms of leans, I like Ohio, Baylor, and Utah. Utah, they're just a wagon at home. I think they have a decent matchup, but West Virginia coming off a disgusting loss, don't really want to bet it. Baylor, yeah, revenge spot on the road. They lost at home in that last game, so I think that they could show up big time for this game. Though I do hate their matchup, that's the only reason I'm not betting it. And Ohio, embarrassed last time those two teams played. Now we're getting them at home where they play incredibly different basketball, like much more motivated. You're probably going to see a blowout in that game. I might still bet it. That's kind of the one I'm kind of sitting on. But I do think they're a much, much better team than Eastern Michigan in general. But yeah, I'm not really sure if I'm going to touch that one unless it drops back to -10, because I believe it's moved to 10.5 now. So unless it gets to -10 again, I'm probably not going to touch it.